55 cars away at Le Mans. 24 hours to go, but you wouldn't have thought so from the pace they set in the early stages. By the time darkness fell, 13 cars had fallen by the wayside, leaving the Ferraris to battle it out amongst themselves.
Ferrari have always been involved in racing, and obviously to produce a car like the short wheelbase to compete in GT racing throughout the world. The car appeared at Nürburgring, 1,000 kilometres, it did the Tour Auto, Le Mans. It appeared at every international racing event up to the late 60s when it had been superseded.
Mike Hawthorne's 5-year-old lap record was smashed when Phil Hill put in a lap of nearly 128 miles an hour.
Well, the most famous driver will be Stirling Moss. Of course, there's lots of Italian drivers, lots of privateers too. The car was well loved by privateers because it was such an easy car to drive. Even today, that's one of the reasons why it's so well loved.
As Stirling Moss said, the fable of him having the radio on and driving, it was a superior car in every sense of the word. The Americans had their own race series at Daytona, Sebring, and these cars appeared at all those events.
It competed in the 1960 and the 1961 and the 1962 Tour de France and won the event 3 years running, even beating a GTO in 1962.
Ferrari have always produced cars that you could actually just drive to races and win, but not in the comfort the short wheelbase offered.
The short wheelbase for me was a real step forwards from the 50s to the 60s, the 59 car, which would have been a long wheelbase, and quite frankly was archaic when you jumped into the 60s and went to the disc brakes, the telescopic shock absorbers, and the short wheelbase car. It handled so much better. There was just a quantum leap forwards.
The production run began with chassis number 1539, which was in 1959, went right through until February 1963 with 4065. There was 167 cars produced, of which 72 were alloy and 10 were right-hand drive.
The car was initially introduced at the Paris Motor Show. This was the first Ferrari to be fitted as standard with the disc brake. But in 1960 they also introduced alloy body. You could have a competition version or the standard Lusso version for luxury. However, all the cars that they produced really were a one-off because you could choose whatever you wanted. You could have alloy body with Lusso interior.
In Turin, on its home ground, they showed it actually without the wheels on to show the disc brakes and the suspension and all the things they developed for the car. You know, it had terrific handling, it had wonderful performance from the V12 engine, and it was a very well packaged car. It was a very complete car. The Ferrari 250 series had a 2,600mm wheelbase length, and then when they introduced a short wheelbase, the Italians call it the Passo Corto, which is short wheelbase in Italian, and they reduced it to 2,400mm, and thereafter that's what the cars all were.
I think that the car came along at the same time as they evolved the engine to a bit more power, but it was definitely the car that made the difference on the race circuit. The long wheelbase cars were definitely a worse handling car, a more difficult car to drive, a heavier car. The steering was heavier, they weren't as comfortable driving position. The short wheelbase really was, for me, a quantum leap forward, a huge leap.
Short wheelbase used a V12 engine with one camshaft per bank, with 3 carburetors. It was actually homologated with 6 carburetors, that was never used. 4-speed gearbox and a live rear axle with semi-electric rear springs and coil springs on the front.
The engine power and its delivery made a big difference to the drivability of the car. Couple that with better suspension and a better gearbox and a much lighter car, well, that makes a huge difference when you're doing the motorsport. They claimed 280 horsepower out of a short wheelbase. I never personally saw it, and we've worked on over a third of all short wheelbases ever produced. We just never saw those figures. Some of the guys that own the 250 short wheelbases today are questioning whether they should be racing competitively in a $15 million car. So therefore, there has become a market for replica cars, which can be raced in the same race meetings for a tenth of the cost.
But we're purchasing cars that, for one reason or another, either have become very rusty or people have taken the engines and gearboxes away from them many years ago, these cars would never be resurrected, they'd never be used. So we are taking these cars, buying them, using their identity, and then we're making the parts that weren't there to produce our reproduction cars.
75 miles at an average of over 115 miles an hour. Here's to them. They deserve it.